So we're super lucky to have Dinesh, the co-founder of Tinder, speak. And yeah, thank you for joining us, and excited to hear what you're going to talk about.
Yeah.
Okay, over to you.
Thanks so much. Is the mic on? Can you guys hear me? Yes. Okay, great. Can we, let's see. There you go. So we don't have that much time, and there's a lot I wanted to cover. I wanted to go deep into OpenAI and a number of other areas, but we're not going to have time here. I'll catch up with some of you individually, possibly later this evening, or in general, stay in touch. Happy to talk more. I guess what I wanted to start with is I wanted to make sure this is not overlapping with a lot of the content programming you guys are already getting. But we're going to go into specific cases based on my experience in building AI businesses or AI that's impacting businesses that I'm heavily involved in. And then we're going to talk a little bit about those illustrations, but I want to give a little backdrop before we start doing that. So I think all of you are familiar with S-curves. Raise your hand if you're familiar with an S-curve. Yeah, almost everybody. So I'll keep the recap sort of limited, but basically we're measuring some performance parameter on the y-axis, and we're measuring cumulative time on the x-axis. And when we're doing this, we see that typically some piece of technology, in this case we're talking about technology, goes through geometric or exponential growth. Typically it's exponential at an inflection point, and then it eventually reaches a stage where it plateaus. And oftentimes that plateau is limited by physical nature or physics. So what we'll find is, sailing ships and powering of the wind that's moving them. The classic example in Innovator's Dilemma would be a hard disk drive performance and the magnetic grain stability as a sort of a limitation, essentially getting the energy density on a hard disk drive replaced by something like NAND flash for storage, which is a digital form of storage, which had better, faster read-write performance on the y-axis, and essentially better energy density for the equivalent amount of bits you were going to store, but it wasn't actually using energy density as the measure. So we start seeing, ultimately technologies replace other technologies and create new S-curves. And we're seeing this across a number of areas. Obviously, you can see where AI is going to impact this, right? Moore's law is already remarkable. The idea of increasing performance, doubling it, every couple of years, and I've seen a version of that, which is every 18 months. And we're talking about sequencing genomes and doing that at an even more rapid pace. It's just remarkable. So I don't want to spend too much time on this. I think everyone in this room already knows the power of AI. But when we start thinking about the scale and pace and urgency of the impact, it's far beyond sometimes what we can actually imagine. So let's talk a little bit about the things that I spend time thinking about. There's so many versions of white papers and decks and reports about sort of the pillars of building, not just LLMs, but broadly, remarkable AI that you can bring to the market. I sort of divide it into technology people, ethics and responsibility, more the white pull over here, and then like systems. And then we have some subtopics to cover. We can't cover all of this today, so what I wanted to do was spend a little time on two of these topics, which is the left and the right. We're going to talk about people and ethics and responsibility to some extent. The domain expertise required to do this, the novel approaches, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of these illustrations, and the incentive design to get this right, I don't think is being thought through very well. And this is all about humans. This is all about people. And here, it's all about people as well. There are conversations happening about responsible AI innovation and setting up consortiums of panels on guardrails for any AI that's developed. Clearly, we have a problem because states, firms, and individuals internationally, globally, don't have the same incentive structures. So why are they going to participate in something that holds back or retards their advancement of their AI models or the impact on their societies if it gives them a chance to leapfrog what a country might be doing or corporations might be doing in a particular country that are essentially held back by the safeguards that they put in place. So it raises a huge problem that we see in other areas that I'm in. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, which is in the climate front, where I'm spending time at Stanford getting my PhD, focused on innovative climate solutions to stem the climate crisis. We're dealing there with the free rider problem, where if you run the game theory around it, it's not quite prisoner's dilemma, but you run into a situation where all parties and stakeholders are not incented to act in collective best interests. We see a similar observation in AI, where not all parties are set up to act in the best interest of the collective. Maybe the best interest is how they define it based on the value system of that particular region or country or corporation or the operating manifesto of a company instead of the collective good, because we actually come from different value systems. So you can imagine how complex this exercise is because of the diversity of the values and the operating manifestos of all of these states, firms, and individuals. So I think this group would agree that AI is happening, it's inevitable, but it's really about the human experience that's shaping that arc. And that's what I want to spend time now talking through in more depth. So in order to do that, I need to give you a little perspective of where I'm coming from. So this is a little bit about me, kind of where I'm spending my time from my academic background to professional background, some of the investments I'm involved in, some of the things I'm doing. It's not comprehensive, it kind of gives you a glimpse of some of the stuff I do. I bring this up primarily because we're going to talk a little bit about some of these companies. We'll talk a little bit about Tinder in a second. But we're also going to talk a little bit about what's happening on the autonomous vehicles front, if we have time. I've invested in a company called Autonomic, which we sold to Ford 13 months after we wrote the first check into the company. And then companies like Zoox, which we sold to Amazon, where when we were having board discussions about whether we go it alone, do we have the capital and do we have the time to build autonomous vehicles that compete with Waymo? I think we were far ahead of Waymo at the time, but we didn't have the funding to do this. And it gets into all of the institutional requirements to build massive AI deployments in any particular sector. It's extraordinary, and very few companies are going to have those resources. And then look at the impact of those resources on the good we're doing, and then the bad we're doing. And that bad comes in many forms, not just the ethics that we just talked about, but also the environmental remediation considerations of the damage we might be doing. If on the previous slide, if you look to the right, you saw the last bullet is about sustainability. If you get a sense of the carbon impact we have from the energy consumption from a lot of these AI models, we're not just talking about the supply chain, the scope 1, 2, and 3 footprint of producing chips. We're talking about the energy consumption of all the collective AI models. It's extraordinary. Estimates have it, and I have some of the numbers, but just to give you like a beer analogy, the amount of energy production that's required to support the incremental energy to support all of the AI processing that's going to happen through 2027 is the same energy footprint that a small country produces, a country like Netherlands, right? And that's just based on a 2023 early estimate at the rate of explosion that we're seeing. This number could be way higher. So we're dealing with a climate crisis and we're dealing with decarbonization issues, but concurrently, if you look at the total atmospheric stock of CO2 at 421 parts per million, sort of increasing almost like at a vertical line, even after a small blip with COVID, which by the way, we only declined about 7% sort of in that period, very small decline. We would need about a 7% decline annualized through 2030 to start to put us on the right path. AI is actually just compounding this problem. And it gets to the ethics of what we're doing. Should there be an offset every time a company has energy processing for AI to advance technology to do some good for training AI models in society? Should there be some offset for that? There's no rules around that, so everyone is playing in a different game. So it creates an absolute wild west for how we're approaching AI. We keep focusing on advancing the models and the technology with training data, but we're not thinking through the broader implications to get a few steps ahead. I'm going to now jump into some of these cases. And not all these companies were mentioned on the previous slide, but I'm going to dive into the ones that I wanted to talk about that I'm involved in. So I'm involved with a company called Synaptica Therapeutics. We wrote an investment. I also run a venture capital firm called Time Zero Capital, and we focus on responsible innovation. Synaptica is using ML-trained neural stimulation of the brain in the default mode network of the brain to halt Alzheimer's disease, Alzheimer's and dementia. Does anyone know what the current medical solutions are for Alzheimer's or dementia? Nothing. Effectively nothing. There is a drug on the market, right? It's sort of following the path, or it is following the path of all the science around amyloids in the brain. And the efficacy of that drug is about 27% across the population that they tested in phase 3 clinical trials. For women, it has 12% efficacy, 12%, with massive side effects. If you were a physician, would you be prescribing this to a woman that has the onset of dementia or Alzheimer's, given those side effects and 12% efficacy? It makes you wonder how it was approved by the FDA. But there was no alternative. You know, arguably one of the diseases of our decade that we have not been able to solve because of sort of the science the vector of science that it's going in, that has been focused on by drug companies to address this, the pharmaceutical industry. So there's a company that's in the medical tech space that came up with neurostimulation, which has been used for a number of different purposes. But it's an ML-based solution on AI that is personalized for you, that you go into a neurology clinic and actually get stimulation that halts the progression of this disease. So if you're just at the onset, you stay at the onset. Now think about this. This is incredible. The gold standard, the 4 gold standard metrics or markers for efficacy at 27% for the current drug. This has 82% efficacy. Phase 2 clinical trials are passed. We're moving into phase 3. More heterogeneous sites, more heterogeneous populations being tested in phase 3. The FDA saw these results. They've been working with us for an extensive period of time. And actually, they deemed it an FDA breakthrough. That's like a clinical term for how the FDA sort of perceives this particular technology. I'm sort of being facetious, it's not clinical. It's a sort of business term. But they deem it an FDA breakthrough. And this is the kind of technologies we can unlock with AI. But I want to point to something here. So, is it referencing this? Yeah, okay, there we go. So it sort of naturally asks the question, what else could be done with this ML approach, right? That's a natural extension. Oh, if we can do this for medtech with neurostimulation, what else can we do? Well, yeah, the company's focused on that. And certainly we could look at how do we use stimulation solutions to address solutions to cancer and mutations of cells and all sorts of stuff. But is that really the right question? How many humans did we save to advance the human condition? How many, I'm going to pick a very small population because I'm at Stanford and I spend time seeing this. How many incredible faculty are in their 70s? And you could say this for NYU here too. They're in their 70s that might be seeing early signs of memory loss and maybe dementia and eventually Alzheimer's potentially depending on the track of their disease. Did we add 20 years to their life and their family's life and their research and the things we would not have ever seen come out of them because they were hamstrung by this disease? So it's not just innovation after innovation, innovation. It's actually giving back life, giving back memories. Why are we on this earth? We're sort of a collection of our memories and then the application of those memories to the things we do in life. Imagine giving back 20 years to an individual and the implications of that for their family and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren and sort of the legacy it leaves, and that's one family. Imagine all the families, and now take it, not just the faculty doing research, but all of the innovators, all of the people contributing to society, and those that are not contributing to society, but living their life and giving back time. When we think about Synaptica, I just don't think about, oh, how do we apply it to the next innovation? It's what is the implication of what we've given back to the people we've saved because they can continue to be a productive member of society, prosper, and be productive members of their families and communities. It's really remarkable when you start to humanize the impact of AI for these types of solutions. I'm going to give you another example of a company I'm involved in. It's the company I'm a founding advisor to. It's called Data, Deception and Truth Analysis. What Jason and Nandan have assembled based on 8 to 10 years of longitudinal research to detect deception in any written document based on their NLP and their ML is also remarkable. I won't go into the specifics, but I'm going to show you some of the data. They have essentially well over 88% efficacy, 88 point, can't remember the exact number, over 88% efficacy. When they read a document and tell you how much deception there is. I have my quarterly LP investment updates now read by Data before I send them out because I think they're truthful, but I want to check on deception. Am I accidentally or inadvertently misleading someone. I would never want to do that. I have my fund administrator review it, I have my compliance firm review it, my wife sometimes looks at it, and I review it. But is that enough? And so I run everything through data. It's remarkable. That's how hygiene should be done when things are being reported. Do you think these companies, and by the way, we don't even have FTX listed here, do you think these companies were doing a lot of hygiene on their 10Ks and their reporting, or their accounting standards, or how they were talking to investors, or their earnings transcripts that were prepared as a result of the calls, which were really an output of all the pre-created Q&A they had that the CEO and management team were prepped for? None of it was done with technology. I don't even know how it was done because there was fraud being conducted, but you can see when we went back and looked at all of that, data could not only detect it, which is sort of remarkable. You can sort of look at a relative comparison of the numbers. I'm not grounding all the numbers, but it gives you an idea. I'm just picking out Enron in 2001, negative 32.1% score. You can go back 8 years before the crisis happened and see all the warning signs. By the way, this company is remarkable. They are, I mean, they have lots of past of being like a data science company. It's a SaaS business, it's a platform, and they're providing that capability to institutional investors and a lot of other areas. I think they'll become the gold standard for hygiene in all investor relations in Fortune 500 and Global 2000 companies using their AI. But beyond doing that for Fortune 500 and Global 2000 companies in detecting deception, going beyond that, they will be able to introduce this if they even had their own investment vehicle. Imagine if you had an investment vehicle in the public capital markets and you could detect deception and make investment decisions preemptively on that. They analyzed all of the public capital markets performance with their current model. And if you looked at where the equity value of those companies exist based on their stock price, their predictive models outperform any benchmark over and over and over again. So the big question for this company is, do they actually become an institutional investor with their proprietary models? They could become the largest global investor in the world as a hedge fund if they wanted to. But I don't think they want to do that. They want to be a technology provider to fix the deception happening with how companies, how entities communicate with their stakeholders. The results here are absolutely remarkable. By the way, they're raising a round and it's going to be oversubscribed. You don't need to express interest, but if you are, let me know quickly because this company is just unbelievable. AI is decoding human emotion. So we've talked about a few examples. We talked about MedTech and what Synaptic is doing. We've talked about data. Now we're going to talk about Monet Analytics. So this is a company I started with Anurag Vis. He sold his last company to Intel quite some time ago. And I got to know Anurag and was blown away by his vision for using AI to address and decode the problems of understanding other people, decoding human emotion.
Yeah, sorry, what's the name of the company?
Monet Analytics, Monet AI. Can someone give me an example of what you could do if you could decode human emotion? Any ideas of commercial applications for this?
Therapy.
What?
Therapy.
Therapy? Absolutely. Yeah. But by the way, just on the therapy front, before we jump down, on so many different vectors of therapy. So if you think about the disease of loneliness that's really taken over society over the last few years, I think coincides quite well with the addiction to smartphones. I'm on the board of the Organization for Social Media Safety, so this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart.
I have a startup on
Yeah.
music therapy.
Oh, interesting. But when you think about loneliness, there are AI chatbots that have been turned into visuals now that have emotional expressions and that are someone to talk to. You're literally talking to an AI, but the representation of the avatar feels so real. But can you imagine if you enhance that so it really connected to someone? I mean, you'd start worrying that there'd be human, machine, physical relationships. I mean, that's been documented in sort of Hollywood in movies, but that's a bigger problem. That's sort of a downstream problem that you might have because someone falls in love with their AI.
Sure.
But this could actually enable that and begin to address that loneliness or mental illness that we're sort of seeing widespread in society, but specifically also addressing loneliness. Sorry, there was another idea here.
Suicidality.
Depression management, absolutely. It's interesting that all of you went to some form of mental health and didn't get into like conventional uses like
Sales.
sales, yes, marketing and sales. Can you imagine every TV commercial that would be ever produced, and not just TV, but social media, video content, would be run through an AI filter to determine if it's resonating with the audience you care about. By the way, that's the first beachhead for Monet Analytics. I find that less responsible and interesting. So we're looking at its application in EdTech. So I teach at a few universities. When I'm teaching with students or engaging with students, sometimes, most of the time they're quite engaged, but if there's like a blank face and I'm doing it over Zoom, normally I'm doing it in person, but there was a period of time where I was doing it over Zoom and some of my classes are hybrid. And if I had an attentiveness score and then go beyond attentiveness, in fact, someone's dealing with a crisis, I'm not sure if it's my responsibility as an instructor, as a professor, to intervene, but I certainly would feel a moral obligation after class to reach out to that student if I knew that they were in distress. And it may not have anything to do with my class. It may not have anything to do with protests on campus. It may not have anything to do with anything that we're aware of. It might be something personal in their life. And they may not be comfortable discussing it, but at least they have an outlet, getting back to mental wellness. So the value of the feedback loop is really powerful. You can also imagine that this could be abused. You were on a Zoom call and you're like me, you're multitasking because you have too many commitments, and you are paying attention, but you're not 100% there, but you can gather 80% of it. I'm schizophrenic, I need to be doing two things at once anyway. If the Zoom host is getting a feedback loop that you're not as attentive as you should be, is that a good or bad thing? So you have to really think downstream about the human condition and the impact of these technologies. But there's a wide variety of applications for Monet Analytics. I want to talk about one more application that's really interesting, where we ran an analysis of what was happening in the political sphere. So I'm not going to get into your into partisan politics here or where you are on the spectrum, but what I would say is that if you look at what happened when Trump was indicted, this is sort of what we came up with. There was a really interesting response from Trump followers and those that were never Trumpers. And as you might expect, Trump followers actually became more ardent followers, an 8% increase in those that were undecided to move about the indictment, not undecided about Trump, but were Trump followers, but heard his speech about being indicted, essentially disclosing that he's been indicted on tens and tens and tens of counts. The count reduction happened recently, so I won't mention the exact number, but they actually became more ardent followers. Very surprising result. You wouldn't expect that, but we could predict it. So we could see their faces based on audiences and based on his speech of how they were going to react. So it gives you some clue about not just lag metrics, but lead metrics to predict what's going to happen. This is incredibly powerful and incredibly scary. You can imagine what's going to happen with polling data over time about how this kind of technology could be used in the political sphere. Okay, just a couple more examples. Let's talk about Tinder. So, how much time do we have, by the way?
10 minutes.
10 minutes? Okay, that'll be tight. Okay, we built Tinder in 2012. It was built inside an internal hackathon with my full-time employees in Hatch Labs. We were a Delaware C Corp funded by IAC, which is here in New York, and Extreme Labs, which is based in Toronto, Canada. They had an office in Palo Alto as well. Those were our two shareholders, two investors. And we were a lab to incubate our own ventures. So we owned each company 100%. And like the 9th company we built was Tinder. And we had some successes and we sold some companies, we had some failures. That was sort of the model. We took a portfolio approach. And I co-founded each company with my head of product where we build it out. In this case, I co-founded with Sean Rapp. And Tinder was born in this internal hackathon because I had an engineer who built something called an interest graph, where he was able to align common interests among different people using Facebook Connect. Now that API was rebranded Facebook Login and since deprecated because Facebook wanted to enter a lot of these markets by themselves. But this engineer, Joe, who's my hacker in residence, was essentially using this interest graph in the local directory space. Think of like Yelp. That's not really the most ideal use case to align people. It seems like this would be more suitable for social discovery. So I said, let's apply this interest graph in this internal hackathon and come up with something in the social discovery space. And Sean very cleverly came up with the idea of this binary concept of, do I have interest or non-interest based on common interest, right? It seems very straightforward if you were applying social discovery to this interest graph. But everyone thinks of Tinder as like, what was the innovation? It was the swipe. It wasn't the swipe. The swipe is just a gesture, it's a manifestation that works well in the human-machine interaction. The innovation was the following. Let's give you an example. Okay, I walk into a restaurant and I meet my friends and I look over in the restaurant to a group of folks having dinner, and I see someone that catches my eye, and I really want to have a conversation with this person. I'm picking a dating example for a second. This could be social discovery for companionship, love, marriage, dating, friendship, activity partners, anything. But I see someone and I want to talk to them. What's the reason I don't go have that conversation?
It might not be reciprocated.
Rejection, fear of rejection, yes? Okay. In behavioral economics or psychology, we call that loss aversion. And if you were to take that further, you could start thinking about omission bias. An act not seen is better than, that you believe might have failed than an act not taken at all. By the way, the Domino's Pizza CEO has a great write-up in HBR about omission bias and loss aversion, and how he increased the stock price like 10x because he changed the culture based on these concepts. It's a great read. I highly recommend it. I recommend it to all my students as well. So in this case, essentially what you're doing is trying to avoid loss aversion, the fear of rejection. But if I could use the chemical engineering analogy for a second, that was my undergrad. You have a barrier you have to cross. If you can lower that activation energy and get to the other side, suddenly there's no fear and you can approach that person you want to talk to. What if a friend at that table noticed you looked over and walked over and whispered in your ear that, my friend would love to talk to you too, or would love to talk to you, or they thought you were interesting, or you should swing by our table or something. Suddenly, what would have been 1 out of 10 chance you might have actually embarked on approaching, unless you have, no risk, unless you have a infinite risk tolerance, suddenly becomes 9 out of 10 that you might actually go approach that person. And so you change this model by essentially creating what we call a double-blind introduction model. It's double-blind, you took away risk from both sides. So the innovation in Tinder, the product insight, was not the swipe. It was inventing a human primal instinct adaptation to change your risk profile to express interest in somebody else. Had we put all this data into an AI model and said, go create another dating app, what do you think it would have done? If it looked at all the products in the market, looked at the space, all the data on the internet, would it have come up with this? What do you think it would have come up with? If it's, I'm roll the clock back, it's 2000, we started in 2012, it's 2011. And there was modern day LLMs and there was all the data on the internet and we could feed it into a model. What would the AI have created for the next generation mobile app? Yeah.
Maybe demographics that tended to predict relational stability over time.
Yeah, that's a great example. I think that's what it would have done. It would have taken existing data and created predictions about where you would have had high matches, depending on the goal. The goal might not be stability of matches. The goal might be for a business to enter a relationship, churn out of the relationship, come back to the app, start paying, and then go back. By the way, Match.com relied on that. I think the average, when we calculate LTV, we didn't calculate it episodically. Habitually, we calculate it episodically, but how many times they return, because the average is about 6. They return about 6 times. When I ran mobile at ISC, before I built Hatch Labs, we built the mobile product for eBay, Match, Ask.com, CityGrid, Vimeo, et cetera. Home Advisor and ING Home Services, I think a lot of you have used these different products we're talking about. And for a Match group, we knew that they would come back even if they stopped subscribing. So it depends what your goals are, and if you fed that in the model, it might design something like that. Or it would have said, what's the biggest source of friction, right? And you could feed that into the model based on the data you had, or it could even observe that, observational insights in its data collection and big data models. And one of the things it could observe is that the friction of creating a profile was really high. It might take hours to create a profile, upload photos, use all that information to then give you recommendations. But that's not the problem. That's solving a little bit of friction. That's solving a pain point, I agree. but you actually end up solving that automatically with a login on top of a social media platform, like Facebook, with Facebook login. So that wasn't really the insight. The insight was understanding humanity, understanding the human condition, and our primal human needs. And could we express interest without the fear of rejection? And again, that was omission, bias, and loss aversion. So when we start to think about the application of AI as sources of innovation, I think we really have to step back and say, what are we trying to accomplish? And then furthermore, and I wish we did this with Tinder, think 2, 3, 4 steps ahead. What are the implications of this innovation we're introducing? Almost every technology we introduce has the potential for massive abuse. We're seeing it in this space, not as, this is a cousin of social media. It's definitely not social media. Social discovery is still somewhat safe, even though the product has been deprecated and it feels like a hookup app now. I'm no longer involved. But social media is a real problem, and it's influencing behavior and polarizing societies. And I don't think anyone predicted 20 years ago, when we all began using Facebook, or maybe we used it a few years later, that that it would be polarizing society in the way it did. And I'm not just picking on Facebook. You could pick any social media platform. I'm on the board of the Organization for Social Media Safety, and we're the rare thing that we have bipartisan support in Congress for legislation. It's a rare thing where both sides are actually coming together because of the damage it can do in society, particularly for children, which is where we're focused. And despite that, technology companies just aren't willing to regulate themselves. So as we train the next future leaders of the AI innovations we're going to introduce into the world, I would say don't just focus on the innovation, focus on the impact to humanity that's a few steps further along, because you have to anticipate those to begin building some guardrails sort of early on. So that's exactly what we talked about. And I wonder if we've created a better or worse world as a result. AI is going to do quite a bit similar to what we've seen the internet do over the last 30 years. That would be my argument. If you look at this list, this is certainly not comprehensive, but it's remarkable, particularly because of digital technologies. AI has the ability to transform so many industries. I gave you a few illustrative examples today. I think Synaptica is the most remarkable and the most interesting, which is the first one we talked about. But this list is almost infinite because it's impacting not just industries, not just verticals, but horizontals. And again, for this audience, I don't have to convince you, but I want you to think about the implications of these displaced victims. What it did not just to the company, what it did to the employees who lost their job, who couldn't put food on the table. There's like real world impact of this displacement. Now, I'm an optimist. I believe the displacement and automation of jobs actually leads to other ecosystems and other opportunities, and it gets filled. And that's happened in almost every revolution, when you went from the Industrial Revolution to the Information Revolution, even if we're talking about AI and generally the advancement of technology. I think there's an offset that happens, but it's not an even offset. So the displacement in the workforce is not even. And so we have to sort of get ahead of that and figure out how it's going to impact everyone, because if we want to create a better, lower Gini coefficient, aggregate society that's advancing, we need to consider that up front. By the way, notice there was an implicit assumption and value judgment when I said this. I said lower Gini coefficient, which is a measure of wealth inequality. Is that a good or bad thing? Well, if you're wealthy and you don't care about other people, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe that's not the goal. But we have to think about states, firms, and individuals, and I would argue states and firms might argue in modern democratic societies that without placing a value judgment on policy, I'm not talking about tax policy, things like that, I wish taxes were lower, but despite that, I do want other people to prosper. I don't want a high Gini coefficient. It's not that I want to take from the wealthy, I want to bring people up so everyone has opportunity. And technology tends to displace those that might not have that opportunity or disenfranchised in the first place. So we have to think a few steps ahead. What are the guardrails for doing this, or how do we make this technology available in a way that doesn't create tectonic shifts in the livelihood of individuals, not just broadly in societies. And so that's what I encourage you to think about, is think a few steps ahead. I'm not gonna have time to talk about Zoox because I think we're probably out of time and I wanna leave a couple minutes for Q&A. But when I was on the board of Zoox, this is something that sort of came up and I thought it was pretty hilarious. the disruption process we're going through and what AI is going to bring is pretty messy, right? I don't know if you guys can read this, but I thought it was really funny because when I'm sitting in driverless vehicles, and I've been in those vehicles since, I don't know, 2016 when I was in Singapore, when Autonomy, before Autonomy was acquired, was in a driverless vehicle taking me around all the way to the test beds of these vehicles in Silicon Valley and in California, when there's no even test driver in the vehicle, and it's pretty remarkable. But it really just got me thinking that these robots that may be sentient someday, which in this case is an adaptation of a vehicle with its AI, just has us trapped, and it's really controlling us, even though we think we're controlling it. So I guess I'll leave you with the end state of the goal is to train models to improve AI. You think that's true? I don't think so. So I think training data is important, and it was referred to earlier, but I don't think that's the goal. So I would argue no. And I think the goal is for an AI to improve the human condition. And we need to think really hard about this. Sorry, my text is getting flipped over because it's on a different computer. And then maybe in the world of Star Trek that I grew up in, we start thinking even more broadly about the human condition. And maybe we think about it as the sentient condition. How do we create a better world for the stakeholders that have a stake in what we're trying to do? And I just want to encourage you, if like one message stays with you, that you think a few steps ahead about the projects that you're working on in your companies, the companies you're building, about the downstream impact, because the rules and regulations are different in every geographic location. Even if there's a consortium, there's variations, and it's you are kind of the gatekeepers who control how, when, and where it's going to be employed. And my goal is for you to employ it responsibly. Okay, thank you. Do we have time for Q&A?
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Questions?
okay.
Anybody have any questions?
Yeah.
Thank you for the remarks. Great insights. I missed the earlier part of it, but you mentioned you teach in some places. And you spoke about the intended and the unintended consequences of some of these things. I have two kids, 12 and 14. How, as they learn and they start to use, as the next generation starts to use and sees the impacts of AI, how do we make sure, just from a societal perspective, that they see both the sides of those, right? And just based on your experience, what do you think, what is the right way to do that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of educational doctoral research going on and general faculty research on the use of AI in education. I'll give you my perspective through a few lenses. One, as you may have heard, I'm not sure when you came in, but I'm also a PhD student, a PhD candidate now, passing my quals at Stanford, focused on inventing the future for dealing with combating the climate crisis. Okay? And so I meet students across the spectrum, from undergraduate to doctoral students and postdocs, that are using AI in different capacities. And then I have the lens of being faculty at UCLA, Anderson, and then I spend most of my time on the East Coast at Harvard and MIT when I'm guest lecturing. We talk about the application of AI, and both among the students and the faculty members. And then I see it in the private sector. So I'll give you sort of a multi-dimensional lens, which is in education, two things. One, you have to present both sides. Your premise of your question is valid. So we start with how it's an incredible tool to enhance your productivity to what you can do. So I took a technical writing course, which was a requirement in my program, and actually thought it would be a waste of time because I thought I was a decent writer, as evidenced by the feedback I get from all the work that I do. And turns out I learned so much in the class. It was incredible because there was just so much I didn't know. But the thing I learned the most is the application of AI as an editing tool. So we start thinking about spell check when it was first introduced, and it was an incremental tool. It was kind of like, wow. And remember how much emphasis there was decades ago on learning to spell correctly? And suddenly spell check would handle that for you. So is spell check cheating? No, we still teach spelling. And there's still tests in school. My kids go to quite a good school in Los Angeles. They're 9 and 12. But they still have to get all their spellings right on their test. They're not necessarily going to win spelling bees, but that's sort of a minimum requirement. But we don't think of spell check as cheating. And the same thing when I write a paragraph and I want to run it through ChatGPT to edit it, or I give prompts for modifying that paragraph or creating the paragraph, is it cheating? And there's a moral question that's happening. But I look at the next generation of technology in using AI or basic LLMs that we have today available to the public as sort of the next spell check, where it's debated about whether it's cheating, for example, where it's really just an evolution of how many tools you have available to advance the quality of your work. If the original insights were original and you had to feed ChatGPT, for example, I'm using that particular element, to constrain the output. But then, so that's widely used, and I think it's generally a good thing. It's a tool, and I think most schools are adopting it because they can't get away from it. It's happening, as I described earlier. It's inevitable. However, what we do in our coursework, and I do this with my students, I give them an example of how they can use an LLM, or I use Bard or ChatGPT, to produce an output, and how this is ethical and good and a great tool for you to save you time so you can focus on other important things that you're juggling, because we all have too much on our plate in society compared to what we might have had 50 years ago. And then you look at an unethical example, and I produce that, and I say, is this acceptable? And so we have that discussion. And I hear both points of view on the unethical example. So we have to have the debate in the classroom, and then we have to use the debate to inform policy for each school, and then schools have to coordinate policy so that there's a uniform understanding. And that process is getting exactly back to the point that because we live in a democratic society, there isn't going to be a top-down didactic instruction on what's accepted or what's not, but there has to be a debate. And I think kids, young kids as well as college students, need to be able to see both sides of it. And if they keep using the technology and not doing the invention themselves, the original thought, they're depriving themselves. That's the output. So you take two people, one that used, and this would be a great longitudinal experiment, one that used ChatGPT for all of their homework over the course of, call it 14, 13, 12 years of their life, and one that didn't use it. And I can almost guarantee, if you can hold all those variables equal, it would be great to do this with twins, right? The quality output longer term for the individual, their thought processes, their logic structures, their ability to critique, their ability to have critical thinking skills is going to far be in excess, this is my hypothesis, of the one that didn't use the tools because they had to do everything themselves. But what was the drawback? Did they have more time for sports and other endeavors? Maybe they became an artist where it wasn't as relevant. So it's not a clean science, but it would be helpful to have the research to inform this process. So what we do in academia is essentially show both sides of it and say, you can choose, but we treat this as unethical. And if you were to do this, for example, with a take-home exam, and we found out, it's not worth the risk. And there's lots of plagiarism detection software that exists. At Warburg Pincus, we were investors in some of those. So hopefully that gives you the perspective of how we're doing it. We're trying to create transparency, trying to create debate, and then setting general guidelines instead of a bright line about what we deem acceptable or not by looking at the underpinnings of why it's unacceptable or not, and then letting the students decide.
Thank you.
Sure.
So I find your final comment to be really interesting. And if we look around us, the pace of technology over the last 20 years or so, it seems like it's been fast, but it's also been imperceptible in some ways, in the sense that we took the human condition for granted as to what does it mean to be a human. And if we take mobile phones as an example, I'd argue that we didn't play that well, right? When I'm on the subway, this is our default position. Every person's on their phone. So we allowed ourselves to get into that position without really fighting for it or fighting for an alternative. That is the default. What's your bullishness on how we play that with AI? Like, are we doomed for the same kind of condition where the technology drives us, or what's our way out to avoid that?
So, two questions. Are we doomed? The path doesn't look great right now. I'm not saying we're doomed, but the path doesn't look good. Let me explain. Even when we know what the likely problem is, we're incapable or unwilling to make the changes necessary to course correct to solve it. Like, so if we had responsible, ethical, balanced leaders, all driving AI inside, private companies inside, governments and organizations, anyone that has any influence had that common moral fortitude and ethical guidelines, I think I would be much more bullish. But everyone should be taking a class like this and having this conversation. And then we have to design for what we want to get. You get what you design for, right? Whether it's a trade, craft, or gift, you get what you design for. We don't have an incentive system that encourages people to adhere to these guidelines. So we have to craft that. Maybe, I'm going to make it up, this is a terrible idea, so please don't do this, but like, maybe there was a virtual point system that badged you on LinkedIn or something by how many points you're earning as reviewed by your peers in the application of technology that was responsible. You know, it's a terrible idea, it wouldn't fly, but something like that. We need to design systems that are course corrections. If we can't do it with a slow-moving freight train that's going to hit a brick wall, which is climate, where state firms and individuals have been unwilling and incapable of making the necessary changes at the scale needed for the urgency of the problem to stem the climate crisis, which the science is so clear on. Having looked at the science myself extensively, it's very clear. And we can't do that. It's very hard for me to be as optimistic that we can do it with AI, where it's very decentralized and distributed as to where the innovations are happening, both on the academic research front as well as in the private sector, where we're actually seeing the commercial applications of these technologies. So I want to give you an optimistic message, but history would suggest, because of behavioral economics and the tragedy of the commons problems and misaligned incentives, and I guess a deviation of the game theory of different stakeholders all working together in concert, that we're not coordinated enough to do that. And there's research on this coordination to solve these types of grand challenges that suggest we haven't got the coordination. So the problems are identified, the solutions to coordinate haven't been developed yet.
Do you
I
think,
concur. Yeah.
do you think that starting with social media, and I have a 13-year-old, TikTok, all of it, and the difference between TikTok here versus what I know in China is more educational, or so I've heard. I don't know the deal, but like, do we start with something like social media and curb that in order to have progress in other areas, or is that where the focus would be, given you're on that board?
So what we do from a policy perspective is above my pay grade, but from the perspective of governance of the Organization for Social Media Safety, I can say that tech companies aren't regulating themselves, and we know that because we talk to the technology companies, and they're not interested because it's in direct tension with the performance of their engagement with their users, and therefore their line metrics of their balance sheet and cash flow. So there has to be regulation, but the regulation has to be very careful not to infringe on our First Amendment rights as people in an educated society that abides by that First Amendment right of freedom of speech. So that's why I said it's above my pay grade, because that has to be designed.
Yeah.
So what we want to do is put in regulation that doesn't infringe on that. And I would argue maybe one way of doing that is you don't infringe on it, but you penalize for the bad outcomes, if there are bad outcomes as a result of that, and let the private sector design solutions for that, essentially design corrective mechanisms because there's a market failure and you're accounting for the externalities, sort of classic economics. I'm not an economist, but that's sort of my approach to it. And if that doesn't work, maybe you take that out of your hand, but you start with that and you take a market forces-based approach to it. Regulation has always existed within the free economy. So we just take a problem where regulation is arguably 30 years behind and just modernize it. And then we test and iterate, right? Anytime regulation is drafted and it's put out, it's never perfect. By definition, it's not perfect. So how do we put it out and then come back and revisit it? The problem is it requires a well-functioning policy and well-functioning political system, which is a bigger problem, ironically, partially as a result of social media.
Yeah.
And so that's why I said it's above my pay grade.
Thank you.
Sure. I think we're probably out of time. But listen, this is so much fun to talk to you. It's the first time I did this talk, and I got to talk a little bit about some of the cool companies I'm involved in. I wish I had more time to talk to you about Synaptica because it's amazing, but hopefully this was helpful.
Thank you. It was super helpful. So I'd like to just quickly summarize what I heard from Dinesh. It was fascinating. What he has to say, talking about the human condition, because I care a lot about connection. And I'm going to summarize this with words starting with C. So if I go off, just let me know. So and you talked about conflict leading to common interest, and then therefore cognition leading to compassion, which is care, and love, which is where it can get really problematic, because love can mean our desire to get sentient, as in couple, and become cyborgs, which will be also problematic. But we know change is the only constant, and which is okay. because the only time it's not okay is when life takes us out of the cycle. And if you're born and raised in India, they talk about nirvana, like breaking the cycle. So I think, and the hardest part in life is when something happens and there's no undo button. So I think I like his analogy of his question of what does it mean to be human and sentient. And the only question is, when you break out of that cycle that you know of, whether you think in terms of nirvana or you think in terms of the cycle that you're in. So that's what I carried away from it. So Dinesh, thank you, and it's very interesting. I know, Cordell, you have to leave, and we wanted you to give a few minutes. I know you got to run, so I want no pressure, but yeah.
Well, so I'll take 2 minutes.
Sure, yeah, please.
So Cordell Schachter, the CIO at US DOT. And really, I had met Ed at another conference, and he suggested I come in. And what I'm very interested in, especially in the field of AI, is having the government learn from industry. Because we have 2 roles with any technology. The easy one, really, is to use technology within our own domains. And the domain of US DOT is mostly providing oversight and regulation. There's a part of us that also is operational, and it's our biggest part, and that's the FAA, where we're responsible for traffic control within the US, operating national airspace, and the standards that we set through an international community really get set for the whole globe. The other part that the government does is we need to make a marketplace, because we believe in the capitalist system and competition, but we want to guard against market failures. And in some ways, we're a government of market failure. That we do those things that the marketplace has tried and failed, or in some cases, not done at all. But it's still necessary for a functioning and healthy democracy. But for the variety of tasks that we do, and I'll just spin off on the last couple of comments made, even when things were better in terms of more bipartisanship and shared goals, it takes so long to pass a law. And then once the law is set, various federal entities like US DOT make rules, but those rules are created in an iterative process. But for those of you who are used to dealing in 2 or 3 week sprints, we're talking about 5 or 6 year sprints to get a new rule in. And some of the constructs almost seem backwards. Like, for example, the laws impacting tech firms stem from the Communications Decency Act passed in the 1990s, when the tech firms were new, and convinced the government there was a need to protect them from financial accountability. Some of those firms that survived are now the largest firms in the world. They don't really need to be protected from financial accountability, but they still have it. So there is no business incentive to guard against some of the harms that now we kind of take for granted as existing, like in social media. And a whole generation potentially being raised on their phone instead of by people. And what effect is that going to have on them throughout the generations? So we have another kind of inflection point with AI. And what are we going to do about it? Is it going to just be left to the individual companies and practitioners to decide what those rules are going to be? Or are we going to wait for the market to fail? And then sometimes we come in and rescue it. In New York City, if any of you are spending time here, every mode of public transportation is run by the government because the private company that created it failed. But it still spun off positive public benefits that are deemed worthy to continue to allow New York City to grow as big as it has and bigger in the future. Because if everyone was in a separate car, there's no way that new people could move around. So for the future and artificial intelligence, what's our path? So Interesting to hear from some of you today, and Ed's excellent technical foundation for these things, not just the how, but why they work. So, with, and I apologize, I have another engagement I have to get to. But if anybody has any questions or statements around those areas, I'd love to hear it. Your tough question.
So I'm working with a few companies that I think provide data solutions and a lot of like potential efficiency gains for the government. At the same time, for us, like it's not necessarily a priority to work with the government because the resourcing and the capabilities to integrate that technology isn't necessarily there. So how do you think about how private companies should be best interfacing with the government to actually drive results in a reasonable time frame when resource allocation from the startup side is quite limited, and if they do spend time working with the government and it ends up taking much longer than expected, that could be an existential risk to the company.
Yeah, we're slow, and we're slow for some good reasons, right? So, like doctors, we don't want to do any harm, and because we're guarding public investment, a lot of people who are paying taxes because they have to, not because they want to, we necessarily spend sometimes $3 to prevent someone from wasting or stealing a single dollar. You guys as business people, you would never do that. You're not going to spend more than $1 to save $1. Plus, you can make decisions to invest in things, invest in lots of things, only have one winner that then pays for all the losers. We're in a position where it's very hard for us to lose at anything. In addition, not only because we're the government and we make rules, we have to follow our own rules, and particularly those around competition. So every time we acquire a service or a product, we have to create a level playing field, have the competition, let people complain they weren't treated fairly in the competition, all while trying to move, in some cases, at the speed of technology. So there's firms that learn to do that with us, and then we give preferences to small and minority-owned businesses, Native American corporations, Alaska Native American corporations at the federal level, to try to improve the market situation for those companies that by law in some cases, or by practice, they were prevented from participating. So the bipartisan infrastructure law has given just DOT $1 trillion to invest in the nation's infrastructure to take us to the next generation, because a lot of the infrastructure that we use was built 50 to 100 years ago. So it makes it very difficult for us to interface. However, as we create new rules, as we pass new laws, as administrations come in with new ideas, the idea is to have the best intelligence from the marketplace to do our best job then in supporting that for future prosperity. Too theoretical?
I think the resource allocation aspect makes sense. I think the goal of creating large scale social impact, I think I agree with that as a whole. But just thinking through, like, as a startup who is creating novel solutions that could be widely applicable and generalized, I think the risk of them being a third party and then trying to interface with the government comes down to like attention and resources for the startup.
Mhm.
And so I guess what I'm thinking through is like, if there were more alignment up front in the design of a system, I think that risk of allocating a lot of sales time towards working with the government and not potentially leading to a dead end, I think you could nip that at the bud initially in working with the government to co-design something. But I think from a resourcing standpoint as well, just like engineers on the government side that can work with people to start testing and integrating those systems. I guess like that's.
So what you may want to do, if that's an interest, is not look to the federal government, but to local and state government. They can move much swifter than we do, because it's a smaller population with this particular need, whether it's climate, employment, industrial, and they would be looking for partners to help in that area. Plus, a larger city like New York City can take an idea that works in a smaller place and then prove it at scale. And a good example of that actually is bike share, which that baby picture of me there on the wall when I had a similar job in New York City is we took a technology that was actually invented in Montreal and had debuted in places like Boston and Chattanooga, Tennessee. And when we brought it to New York City, we were suddenly going to go from a system that had hundreds of bikes to thousands of bikes. So, through a technology change happening simultaneously, but once it was proven here now, it spread like wildfire across the rest of the country. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you, Ed. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Cordell, really appreciate it. I think it's gonna say